All right, so you probably remember a couple months ago when Joe Biden was getting heaps of credit from the mainstream media and even some independent leftist YouTubers who were giving him credit for announcing that he was going to be ending U.S. support of the Saudi-led genocide in Yemen. And he made this promise, and according to the headlines that we saw at the time, like this one, it seemed like it was somewhat clear and decisive that he was really going to be ending U.S. weapon sales to Saudi Arabia that they are then using to conduct a genocide in Yemen as in a coordination with their blockade as well. There's a massive blockade of all these supplies and food that are necessary to get into Yemen, and the result of this Saudi-led blockade and offensive in Yemen has led to literally the worst humanitarian crisis on the entire planet. And so we were seeing headlines like this: Biden ending U.S. support for Saudi-led offensive in Yemen. And a couple of us in independent media were pointing out the specific language that they were using in headlines like this, with using the words offensive, because what I know from U.S. foreign policy is the United States never considers themselves to be the aggressor or the offensive actor in many of these cases. And so if Joe Biden was releasing statements like this where we're going to end offensive support for Saudi Arabia, what that kind of clicked in my mind was, well, probably what he means is we're just going to start calling everything we're doing over there defensive and just not admit the things that we're doing are offensive, and just use a little trick there to convince people that he's doing something that's good when he's not actually changing anything substantively. And it seems like a lot of those fears were well warranted, because months after Biden promised to end support for Yemen war, Congress still has no details. After enjoying a very public relations victory, the Biden administration has yet to offer any specifics on the nature of American participation in the Saudi-led war. So here are some details on this. More than 2 months after President Joe Biden announced that he would end all American support for offensive operations in the war in Yemen, including relevant arms sales, his administration has yet to detail what forms of support the U.S. has actually cut off. Biden made the statement in a February address, but he also promised to help defend Saudi Arabia from missile attacks and threats from Iranian-supplied forces, an apparent reference to assaults by Houthi rebels fighting the Saudi-backed government of Yemen. That left many members of Congress questioning how the administration would distinguish between offensive and defensive military support. So 41 progressive members of Congress wrote to Biden asking him to clarify what forms of support he had discontinued and which Trump-era arms sales he would deem relevant to offensive operations, and the letter requested a response before March 25th. 6 years to the day after a coalition of countries led by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates launched their intervention to defeat Iranian-backed Houthis. The intervention was supported by the United States and both the Obama and Trump administrations, providing weapons, intelligence, and until 2018, mid-air refueling support for Saudi aircraft. But almost 2 weeks after the deadline, the administration still has not responded to the letter. A spokesperson for the State Department referred the intercept to the White House, and a spokesperson for the White House did not respond to multiple requests for comments. Quote, months after enjoying an initial public relations victory by announcing an end to U.S. involvement in offensive Saudi actions in Yemen, the Biden administration has yet to offer any specifics of the nature of previous or current American participation in the Saudi-led war, said a Democratic aide with knowledge of the letter. So basically, he said, I'm going to end our support of the Saudi offensive in Yemen. What he really seems to have meant is, I'm just going to change my language and start calling these things that we were previously calling offensive and just start calling them defensive. I mean, this is the same thing that we do in foreign policy all across the world, right? This is the same way that the United States calls Iran the aggressor, even though we're the ones who are illegally sanctioning them. We're the ones who assassinated Qasem Soleimani, one of their top generals. We're the ones who pulled out of the 2014 Iran nuclear agreement. We're the ones who have military and troops stationed all around surrounding their countries. Even given all of those circumstances, the United States still, and the U.S. media and correspondents usually, still says that Iran is somehow the aggressor in this circumstance. It boggles your mind. It doesn't make any sense from any different angle. But that's how they talk about these types of issues. And so that's why we were hesitant to actually believe that Joe Biden was going to follow through on a lot of this stuff. And so pertinent to the arms deal, specifically to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, we have some more information. indicating that Joe Biden is not following through on his promise to end U.S. support of the genocide in Yemen. Shame Biden to advance Trump-era sale of $23 billion in F-35s and armed drones to the UAE. So here's some details on this recent arms sale that he is continuing. The Biden administration has reportedly informed Congress that it is planning to advance a $23.4 billion arms sale of weaponry to the UAE that was linked under former President Donald Trump, a move anti-war critics announced as a betrayal of President Joe Biden's recent pledge to end U.S. support of offensive operations in Yemen. One of the major members of the Saudi-led coalition that has been bombing and strangling Yemen since 2015, the UAE is set to receive 50 F-35 fighter jets, more than a dozen armed drones, and billions of dollars worth of munitions from the U.S. if the deal receives final approval. The State Department spokesperson told the Huffington Post Tuesday that the administration intends to move forward with these proposed defense sales to UAE, even as we continue reviewing details and consulting with Emirati officials to ensure that we have developed mutual understandings with respect to Emirati obligations before, during, and after delivery. The spokesperson would not comment on the New York Center for Foreign Policy Affairs' ongoing lawsuit against the State Department over the sale, which the nonprofit group says is illegal. And they say, quote, "It is our hope that the Biden administration will put mitigating a humanitarian crisis of global proportions before putting arms sales in the hands of an aggressor nation like the UAE," Justin Russell, principal director of the New York Center for Foreign Policy Affairs, told Huffington Post, referring to the UAE interventions in Yemen and Libya. And so this is what we have. I mean, this is Joe Biden for you, right? So he goes out there, he publicly says, I'm going to end the genocide in Yemen, right? I am going to end U.S. support of the genocide in Yemen. First of all, let's get this clear. The United States has all of the chips in this circumstance, okay? The United States has the power to really, with just a couple phone calls, make sure that this stops. They can pressure Saudi Arabia to end the blockade that are keeping some of these supply and food and supplies that are needed in Yemen right now. They can get on the phone and pressure Saudi Arabia to end that blockade and alleviate some of the pain. I mean, we've seen recent articles that are projecting hundreds of thousands of children are at risk of starvation in Yemen because of this blockade, because of the arms sales that we have been giving to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which they then go use on Yemeni civilians in many cases. Okay? There are stories of Yemeni civilians who are walking around after their family members, their loved ones are blown up, and they're seeing U.S. bombs on the ground. This is not something any of us should be okay with, right? And so this is why it's important to talk about these things, because you have to get into the details. You have to get into the weeds on some of these issues, because the headlines that we see from the mainstream media are never the reality. Okay, they never tell you the full picture in just a headline. So when we saw all of these headlines that were saying Biden is ending U.S. support of the offensive Saudi-led genocide in Yemen, it turns out he's not really doing that. He's keeping the arms sales going, like we just saw with the example to the UAE. We haven't seen a complete end to the blockade. And he, in addition to that, I mean, we also saw other circumstances with his relationship to UAE. Joe Biden said while he was campaigning that he was going to make Saudi Arabia the pariah that they are. And what did we see? Well, he releases the report on the confirmation, basically, that Saudi Arabia and MBS, their leader, specifically ordered the killing and dismemberment of a U.S. resident and journalist, Jamal Khashoggi. And what does Biden do in response to that? Well, he slaps down some sanctions on a couple officials or people who were involved in the killing. He doesn't touch MBS. And then he goes and he bombs people who MBS would have wanted him to bomb in Syria. So he doesn't have a serious redress of our relationship with Saudi Arabia. He's not willing to take that heat that he would take, the political pressure, all of these other influences that are in line with these types of issues. He's not willing to take that heat to seriously confront Saudi Arabia. And that's becoming more and more clear. And the result of it is likely going to be the perpetuation of the worst humanitarian crisis in the entire world.